So for this section of Unit 9, we'll be discussing home life during the Civil War. Our essential question for this section is, what impact did the war have on everyday Americans? Sorry for that. All right, so we're going to start with the North. So, as you know, the North was the industrialized region of the United States, and therefore they prospered in the industrial sector during the Civil War. Immigrants provided labor in these factories. The income tax was created to help fund the war, and also tariffs were raised to protect American industry. Congress also passed the Homestead Act in 1862, and this is going to be important for encouraging more Americans to move out to the western part of the territories. The Homestead Act gave you free land if you moved out west, 160 acres. The only conditions were you had to agree to live on that land for at least 5 years and to improve the land. So cultivate it for crops, build a well, basically make that land inhabitable, because prior to the Homestead Act, it was mostly just unused prairie land. So the purpose of this was to continue to expand the Union. During the war, we also see the creation of greenbacks. They were created to finance the Union's war effort during the Civil War. And it was the first time in the United States that we saw paper money with green ink, which we're all obviously familiar with today. Even if we're poor, we've still seen money. So by the time that the war has been fought for a couple of years, people on both sides are more wary about joining the war effort. They've seen the battlefield photos, they've seen, relatives or friends come home from war with major injuries. So in 1863, the Union instituted conscription, also known as the draft. Just like past wars, if you were called to war, you could pay someone to take your place, which means that the wealthy and the elite, members of Congress, people who created this war, didn't have to do the actual serving in the military. So this caused a lot of disruption in the North. A lot of people criticized it as being a rich man's war being fought by the poor. The institution of the draft led to riots across the Union, the largest and the deadliest being in New York City. Sorry. So here's some images we see from the New York riots. We can see here that the man being attacked is African American. Unfortunately, a result of the riots was an attack on free Black people, because often the ones who are being called to war, who typically were immigrants from Europe or poor white men, saw this now as a war being fought for slavery, and therefore to the advantage of Black people. So they took out their anger on the African American community. So let's shift to the South. The Union blockade, the first part of their Anaconda Plan, was 80% effective. The South was left almost entirely on their own, and as we know, they didn't have the industry, the railroads to be able to function within the South the way they needed to fight a war. It was hard to transport goods. The few railroads that they had, the Union had taken control of and had blocked. They were also blocking rivers, not allowing the Confederates to use those to move. They also had little money to finance the war. Obviously, their economy was based on agriculture and slavery. And with the blockade, they are not able to make as much profit from trade. So they created their own money. Those of us who know basic economics, if you just create your own money and put as much as you want into circulation, that leads to inflation. The money is not valued as high, which leads to an increase in prices. So we also saw riots in the South over shortages of basic needs. This image, take a moment to look at it. It shows you the prices of goods in the South in 1860 versus right in the midst of the Civil War, 1863. Most of these things were considered necessities in the 1860s. You had to have candles to light your home. You had to have butter and lard to cook, sugar and flour and bacon. They were necessities. In 1863, most families can't afford that price. So we see here an image from the bread riots in Virginia. So let's talk a little bit about the life of a soldier. In the South, 4 out of 5 men served in the military. If you were an able-bodied young man, well, not even young, older men fought as well, you were expected to serve in the military. For many, this was their first taste of travel. They had lived within their own small communities their entire life. Most regiments were formed from the same town, so you were traveling and fighting alongside your friends, your brothers, which unfortunately meant that anytime you went into a battle, those being killed were people that you were close to and cared strongly about. The camps were gross. This was everywhere. There was poor drinking water. They lacked sanitation. So disease would spread quickly throughout the camps, which would lead to death off of the battlefield. When not fighting, soldiers often played cards, played games. We saw in the video, wrote letters to home, hung out with their buddies. We can see here, these are actual photographs from a Civil War camp. Obviously not the height of luxury. So for these men who were sacrificing their life to fight for their country, they were not living in great conditions. People who lived in even worse conditions were prisoners of war held at Andersonville, a southern POW camp in Georgia. So these are Union soldiers that are being held here that have been captured by Confederate troops. People who survived Andersonville said that they would have preferred to die on the battlefield than spend their time at Andersonville. During the course of the war, the camp wasn't even open the entire war, so just a couple of years, over 12,000 soldiers died at Andersonville. The South could barely afford to feed their own soldiers, so they're certainly not going to feed Union soldiers and have less for their own. So these next images show some men who were held at Andersonville. Most of us have seen images from the Holocaust, and these are very similar, just bare bones, barely surviving because they were basically being starved to death. So 30% of the prisoners that were held in Andersonville did die, and it was open for 14 months. We can see here men being hanged for some crime that they may have committed, probably trying to escape, if I was asked to take a guess. A prisoner that was held at Andersonville, Thomas O'Day, after he gained his freedom, he provided the memories of Andersonville. So we have this drawing of how Andersonville was set up. We can see the walls to keep the prisoners in. We can see that there's no housing for them to sleep in. Even though we're in the South and it's typically warmer than up north, it still gets cold. So these men, no matter the conditions, were exposed to those conditions. A terrible place to be. So on both sides of the battle, in the North and the South, women had to take the place of men on farms and in businesses. So it was the women who really kept the home front going during the war. Women also transitioned into being nurses to care for the wounded on the battlefield. Clara Barton was one of those. She was a Union nurse. She worked during the Civil War. She was unpaid. She was untrained. But it was her work that helped lead to advances in battlefield medicine and medicine in general. And she later went on to help found the American Red Cross after the war. So these next images show us some Civil War battlefield images. Amputations were very common. There was no anesthetic. You would be given something to kind of help put you in a fog, but you were still awake. You were aware that your limb was being severed from your body against your will. But that was necessary in order to save the person's life. We see here the tools that would have been used on a military battlefield, very rudimentary. However, it was the war that caused so many advances in medicine at the end of the 1800s, going into the 20th century. Here we see a group of veterans, every single one of them impacted by the war in some way.